Welcome to the session, which is Evolution and the Science of Eugenics. It's quite a in-depth session, so I would encourage you might want to, if you do have any questions, please put them down in the public chat. And then also at the same time, we will make a note of that for Q&A after. So hope you can all hear me still. In terms of today's session, what are we going to cover? We're going to be following on from the origins of nations and the study of race. We'll be taking a deep dive into the 19th and 20th century to explore evolution and the rise of eugenics. And why is that important? Well, citizens need to understand the impact of evolution theory on science, on governments, and on lawmaking. And that means that the learning outcomes for us is being able to see evolution theory in practice in society and know how to respond. It is specifically a time of spectating, and just to alert you, there will be a video. It's a 10-minute video that we need to fit in as well, which is quite an important video. So that will be something that we will watch, and we're going to try to put some time aside for Q&A. So please, like I said, put your questions up within the public chat, and we will make a record of that so we can respond afterwards. So first things first, in order, I'm jumping between two slides just so you're aware, because I have my notes. The first things first we're going to look at is the history of the theory of evolution. And in order to do that, we need to start really with what happened before the theory of evolution came to the table, as it were, and became so prominent. And the first thing is that before evolution, many people had tried to answer the question of what is life. And I think that that's the question that fundamentally sits underneath all of this. It's man's ability to theorize what is life, how it begins, how it moves forward and progresses, and how that then affects us. And these theories before evolution were really fueled by religious, cosmological, and philosophical sources of information. And so a lot of the root of these ideas about what is life can also be found in the works of Plato and Aristotle. And one of the key ones that sort of traveled along sort of generations, which was held on to, was the one that Aristotle held, which was a view of that living things are all of one kind, but they were animated by different types of soul. So he had this sort of hierarchy of souls, in effect. The one first was rocks, which actually were inanimate and soulless. And then there was the next level was plants, which were vegetative souls, which can grow. Then animals, which were considered to be sensitive souls and can move. And then finally humans, which were rational souls who had the capability of reason. And so within his model, organisms existed along a line of growing complexity. And that then contributed to increasing their value in the environment. So rocks were less valuable than plants, plants were less valuable than animals, animals are less valuable than humans, simply because as they grew, the soul grew more complex, it contributed more to the environment it was in, and so had greater value. So that was one of the key themes of what is life that was trending during that period. So when we move on a little bit, we find that there was a growth in that, and it was really led by this gentleman called Plotinus, who was a Hellenistic philosopher living in Roman Egypt. And he actually took Aristotle's model, but developed it by drawing upon mystical sources for reference. And so he held on to the clear and logical analysis of Plato in regards to the soul, but he developed it by bringing in this mystical element. And under the umbrella of what we call Neoplatonism, which was really a theory that, I should say, a line of thinkers between 428 to 347 BC. What he did was he basically took Aristotle's hierarchy and he spiritualized it. So in that regard, what he did was he added higher forms to that existing structure that Aristotle had laid down. And those forms were essentially transformed into purely spiritual or immaterial beings. And so if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll see that the first thing that he taught was that there was a supreme, totally transcendent one at the top. And the one couldn't be an existing thing and couldn't be merely the sum of all the things below it, but had to be also prior to everything that existed. And hence you couldn't ascribe any attributes to the one, but emanating from the one was what was called the nous. And the nous was basically the concept of thought, and its function was to contemplate on the one, and all thoughts that derived from the one. And then from the nous proceeded the soul, and within the soul there was this upper and lower division. The upper related to the nous, which was the thought about thought regarding the one, and the lower aspect of the soul related with nature. And then from the soul proceeded individual human souls, and then at the bottom of all of this is matter, and that was the lowest level of being, and it was obviously the least perfected. So you had this idea of a gradient. So the more that you were at the bottom, it was less perfected. The more you rose to the top, it was more perfection. And the thing about this work by this gentleman Plotinus was that his development shaped other Western philosophies, and it inspired centuries of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thinkers. And a lot of his work, you can see around this, impacted the theology of St. Augustine as well. Now, as we move on a little bit further, we see that St. Augustine, under scholasticism, borrowed that basic theme from Neoplatonism, and then he, what we call, theologized it into Christian understanding. So whilst the lower realm remained the same, the higher intelligence sphere and the notion of the one shifted. So in the previous model by Plotinus, you had the one at the top. Well, that was replaced with the person and triune God of Christianity. And then below God, he added in these higher spiritual beings, vis-a-vis angels. And then finally, what he did was he said, well, the ideas of everything else underneath that, which were considered as ideas or forms, he also called them universals. And these were things that were in the lower realm, but they had existed in the mind of God. You can actually see within these concepts in these last few slides, the religious and philosophical influences coming through, and less the scientific. But this was called the Great Chain of Being. And the basic scheme of the Great Chain of Being, it endured throughout the medieval period. It was a prominent thought when regarding to looking at life. And although there were some disputes about it, and that generally was around the nature of universals and the extent to which human beings could participate in or know the thoughts of God, most of the actual scholastic thinkers of the time, they moved into the realm of dividing the earthly beings into distinct species. But nonetheless, they didn't mess around with the higher realm of thought about God and angels. It was and demons. It was generally accepted. Some of the questions they posed and thought about was that, well, since humans participate in both earthly and spiritual realms, their movement through life was considered to be a journey towards God. So this sort of scale had within it this idea of levels. And so temptations of the earthly or the mortal flesh led to evil, and hence why you were reduced in the scale. And yet, if you focused on that which was heavenly, then you were escalated in scale. So the way of the spirit lifted upwards towards God, while the desires of the flesh sank you into debased desires of evil and animal tendencies. So what we had then after that was this sense of, within this period of medieval period, was with the development of biological taxonomy in the late 17th century, and it's something I talked about in the last presentation. You began to get these two opposing forces of what in terms of Western thinking, and the first was basically essentialism, and that was the belief that every species had characteristics which were unalterable. And it actually fitted well with natural theology. So the previous slide that I showed you that was really driven by St. Augustine really tended towards natural theology. So it's this idea that everything was created by a divine creator, that every species did not change over time, and it also consisted of a young earth or short creation, and also that each species was perfectly designed, so that there was no flaws considered to be within the species. So those are the four key elements of what bore out as natural theology. It was explaining the world through a theological position that considered the divine creator at the heart of it, that species didn't change over time, a young earth or short creation, and that species were perfectly designed. The thing about it at that time, though, was natural theology was very rigid. So it wasn't interested in understanding the mechanism about how things worked. So when it considered the natural world, it wasn't concerned about the way a beetle moved, or it wasn't concerned about the way a fish swam in. It wasn't concerned about necessarily the technical elements or mechanisms of reproduction. The emphasis was, as long as we know it's created by the divine, as long as we accept that species don't change, and that it was, according to a biblical account, of a short creation, and that species were perfect, everything's fine, thumbs up. So that was the one view that had been sort of developed from scholasticism under St. Augustine. But then what came in as a contravening view was the anti-Aristotelian movement. And that was basically a new way of looking at the world through physical sciences. And this began to suit natural history. And so natural history is the domain of where there's inquiry about organisms that includes animals, fungi, and plants in their natural environment, and learning more towards observational than experimental methods of study. So you began to see the rise of what we call naturalists or natural historians. These were people that were not happy with the answers that came from natural theology, and they felt that there was more to be studied through observation for natural history. And so it cultivated a society of people who wanted to explore and observe the natural world and examine it and analyze it, and test that against the natural theological position. And so a person who studies natural history is called a naturalist or a natural historian, and that's where it gave rise to that. And so in the Western world, you had this conflict basically between natural theology and natural history. Now, most of us think, when we think of the theory of evolution, we tend to think of Darwin. And actually, the first person, there was a gentleman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who actually came from the naturalist movement. He was one of the leading sort of proponents within it. And he was the first actually to propose a theory of evolution. And as naturalists began to study at that time the earth around them and the species around them, other things emerged which began to challenge the doctrine of natural theology. And one of those things was the emergence of paleontology, because it brought in this idea that animals could become extinct. And it also brought in this idea that nature wasn't static, In other words, that there was change within nature. And so this gentleman, who was actually a soldier, he was a biologist and an academic, he proposed a very early idea of biological evolution. And this was consistent with natural law. And so he was one of the first to construct this theoretical framework of organic evolution. And he called it the theory of transmutation of species. But it was considered the first because it was fully formed in terms of the idea he proposed. So Lamarck's transmutation of species proposed a very interesting idea that was new then, may not be new now, and it was the idea of the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And what that basically meant was that organisms develop new organs or modify existing organs due to environmental problems. And so although he recognized that an organism might inherit characteristics from its predecessor, its parents, in other words, okay, he also recognized the idea that within the environment, based on the challenges and difficulties within the environment, an organism might actually develop new capabilities in order to survive within that environment they're in. And he uses the example of a giraffe, where he described that ancestral giraffes, and this is the one I'm pointing to on the left, would have had shorter necks, like many other mammals. However, the more that giraffe had to strain in order to reach out to higher branches to get essentially to survive in terms of to get food, that this required it to have higher shoulders and a longer neck. And that as through the process of giraffes doing this, then this modification would be passed on to the next generation. And as a result, specifically the shoulders and the neck would become highly developed. And also any other particular parts of the giraffe that wasn't necessary would degenerate. And then so you would see this sort of evolution, which is highly specialized, taking place within the generations of a particular organism, in this case, a giraffe. Now, obviously, this particular theory, as we went along throughout the century, was discredited because it was the idea that a giraffe could evolve within a number of generations and adapt to the environment around it. So that was discredited because there was a lack of data to support that. But however, the idea of inheriting traits from your predecessor was actually a common sense approach that was still kept within the naturalist community. So they discarded one element of his theory, but they maintained, because they had more data, the proof that that there was consistency in his thought there. And this can be summarized in what was said by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which I thought was an interesting statement, where he said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." And I think that that's something that really sort of highlights in that period the struggle that the naturalist had in acquiring data and working that data through their theories. And so you see, for a lot of time, you see many theories coming out, but either there's a lack in data or the data says otherwise, and that they've tried to manipulate that data to get the outcome that they want. This was a highly experimental period, and so nobody had the sort of the necessary, maybe not all the information in order to make a decision on some of the theories that they were proposing. Now, when we move a little bit further, we actually come to Darwin's theory of evolution. And Darwin was very much aware of Lamarck's position. And actually, agreed on the basis of the inheritance or the hereditary nature of of species in terms of the passing on of characteristics. So he was very much aware of that, and he agreed with that. But what he did, and it wasn't just himself, it was also Alfred Wallace. And although Darwin is well known, it was actually his first book was on the origin of species, was a collaboration effort between himself and Alfred Wallace. But his was the theory of evolution by natural selection, and that was published in the mid 19th century, and that was under the book called The Origin of Species. And the thing about his view was that his theory was based on the fact that plants and animals best adapted to their environment. If they adapted, they will survive, and then they reproduce and transfer their genes to the next generation. So there was a degree of adaptation which would take place, nothing like what Lamarck was suggesting in terms of shoulder change and extension in terms of within the neck of a giraffe. But he was saying that over many, many generations, as animals adapted to their environment and survived their environment, those adaptations would be reproduced within their generations because of the transfer of their genes from generation to generation. And obviously his best work was summarized within his research around finches, where he would look at the changes within beaks across a variety of different finches over time. And this is really important because his investigation, his research, his laboratory, which was in the world, it wasn't in the back of a house per se, but it was actually in the Galapagos Islands, for example, gave him a lot of evidence regarding the progress of species or the progress of organisms who were adapting to the environment they were in and passing on that adaptation to the next generation. Now, the challenge about his theory, which was quite a scare to those who lean to natural theology, was the fact that it undermined the four basic tenets that I mentioned earlier. It went contrary to the fact that there was a divine creator. It went contrary to the fact that species did not change, because it provided evidence that species did change. And it also brought in this idea of not a short or young Earth, but it brought in this idea of an old Earth, because Darwin had to propose the idea that these changes, although very small, were over a very significant long period of time. And it also challenged the notion of intelligent design. The idea, although that's a word that came much later in terms of 20th century, it challenged the idea that everything was designed by God was perfect. And so this is where there were real challenges with his theory, because it was in that time challenging natural theology. And it was challenging natural theology with evidence. So the thing about what it did do as well, on the flip side of that, especially amongst naturalists, is that it progressed natural history from observation and description into biology, which biology is more focused on testing theories about living things. So it developed the work that previously was done from Lamarck, for example. It moved it not just observation. It moved natural history from observation to testing, and that's where biology then comes out of that as a scientific discipline. Now, I just would like to say as well at this point that when we're talking about Darwin's theory of evolution and we're talking about natural selection, we have to bring in within this a conversation around what is known today as microevolution and macroevolution, because really this is what it underpins what Darwin's research was saying, which was causing so much challenge to the society of the day. The first is microevolution, and microevolution, which you see on the left with dogs or wolves as an example, is about genetic change within one population from one generation to the next. And this term is another term that's used for microevolution is adaptation. It's about how much change can take place within one kind of species, one kind of organism. And the fact of the matter is, there's no arguments on that side of things. But there would have been an argument if you stood with the natural theology position, because the natural theology position said that animals don't change. And so one of the challenges that those who were biblically minded in those days had was the fact that evidence was being shown to them about change within a particular organism. And they were struggling to accept that because their natural theology was saying that animals are perfect and do not change. Now, we don't think from that position in terms of today. We accept that there is change or microevolution within all kinds of life. But in those days, they didn't. And that's where there was this big resistance. So there was a rigidity to natural theology that had a significant impact on its level of acceptance and dialogue with natural history. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So microevolution deals with the adaptation that takes place within a particular kind of organism. And the thing about microevolution is you can actually measure that, because that can take place within your time. You know, if you look at our societies, especially domesticated animals, whether it's horses, for example, or dogs or cats, you can see with the different pedigrees of animals, you can see man's involvement in not just observation, but in testing to produce new breeds. So in terms of microevolution, we can see that, we can test that, we can prove that, yes, it is true that within a specific organism or specific species, or particular kind, there are variations. And you can manipulate those variations. And we see that from wolf kind down to small dog. Now, the challenge wasn't there for us today, but it was then for those who were the natural stood with natural theology. But the bigger challenge was the macroevolution, because the macroevolution is a process which talks about new species arising. And the challenge with that, which is contrary to microevolution, is you cannot witness that. So you cannot, there is no, nobody can witness the change from a marine animal to a reptile to a mammal to a human. Nobody can witness that. And so you have to rely on your assessment of the past in order to determine, and you have to do what we call fill in the gaps. You need to find the milestones, or you need to find the key steps between these species to be able to validate that one species is changing to another. And it's that element which also connects to the idea of an old Earth. Because as soon as you go down that route of saying that there can be a change from one species to another, then you bring in time, and you have to add in a lot of time in order to do that. You know, I recall reading a lot of books when I was younger, where the idea about the age of the Earth was usually around sort of, at the time, sort of 1 million to 2 million to 3 million years, whereas now they're talking about 250, 500, even more than that. So in other words, the more that they are discovering and the more that they are seeking to build these connections into the history of the ancestry of organisms, the further you have to go back in time to accommodate that. And that's the problem, basically. So now the key thing as well to be aware of is Darwin acknowledged these problems. So Darwin didn't necessarily say, oh, this is all, I've got this all completely right. Not at all. He said he's got evidence for microevolution, and he provided that with finches and many other animals, but he couldn't provide the evidence for macroevolution. And so the rest of natural history and naturalists who moved then into biology and biologists have continued the work of seeking to prove the macroevolution theory. They sought to prove that within society through their scientific investigations. So this now moves us on to the next phase of Darwinism, which really moves it from a theory that was observing nature and testing nature to what we could call population control. And it's quite significant. You see, what happened basically was after Darwin published his theories on biological evolution and natural selection, a gentleman by the name of Herbert Spencer drew further parallels between his own economic theories and Darwin's scientific principles. So he saw that Herbert saw there was a connection between the two. And his theories were very loose. They were a set of ideologies to justify political, social, and economic views. But what happened was that he utilized the term survival of the fittest in order to push the political idea of unrestrained capitalism. And this was during the Industrial Revolution. And so it was the idea that businesses should operate with little regulation from government. And so unlike Darwin, Spencer believed that people could genetically pass learned qualities such as frugality and morality onto their children. So Spencer really opposed any laws that helped workers or the poor and those he deemed genetically weak. Such laws, he argued, would go against the evolution of civilization by delaying the extinction of the unfit. So in other words, the concept of the survival of the fittest, which, by the way, Charles Darwin used, but he only applied that to the natural world, as in to animals and to plants. He did not apply that to humans. Spencer applies that to humans. He basically says the same challenges of natural selection don't just exist in animals and in plants and in birds, but it also exists in humans. And actually, just in the same way that weaker animals, weaker plants do not survive because nature determines that they're incapable of surviving and only the strong survive. So in the same way, that view should be applied to society and to civilization. And as a result, then, if you are the poor, if you are the weak, then the goal, the emphasis is that the natural law should be, you should be fighting to overcome, to prove yourself. And if you don't overcome, well, you shouldn't have existed in the first place. Your extinction means that you're unfit. And so social Darwinism comes out of Darwin's theory of biological evolution and natural selection based on those concepts being transferred from the animal world, from natural history to do with the animal world and plant life into civilization and society. Now, let me just make sure I've got the right one. Now, the thing is that social Darwinism began to gain popularity, okay? And it began to gain popularity amongst those who were elite. And so what you found was that people began to really adopt the ideas, and they began it was compounded with the increase of immigration into countries. And so this idea of preserving society and maintaining society and building nationhood, it meant that social Darwinism became a philosophy and a way of protecting the nation and its values and its inheritance and its heritage from those who were weak or for those who were different. And so by the time we get to the late 1800s, you have this gentleman, a British scholar by the name of Sir Francis Galton, who happens to be the half cousin of Darwin. And I don't think that was an accident. And so he launches this new science, and the emphasis there was not only was it about, as Herbert Spencer purported, was the idea of actually survival of the fittest, but now we should focus on improving the human race. And you can do that by ridding society of the undesirables. And so that becomes the theory of eugenics. It's this idea of really what it is purging society, so that society can become better. And so Galton proposed that to better humankind, the British elite needed to be the ones propagating a certain standard of life. So elitism really, what we're seeing here really is really seen to as a greater or lesser degree, is this classism influencing science, and with that classism, a sort of political rhetoric, a philosophical and political rhetoric coming in, that says we are better because we've done X, Y, Z, and that is the standard for humankind, and we should put more weight behind that. And if you can't survive in this climate, then it highlights that you're not really part of us. He argued that social institutions such as welfare and mental asylums allowed inferior humans to survive, and not just to survive, but to reproduce at higher levels than their superior counterparts in Britain's wealthy class. So any sort of charitable organization at that time, which was driven to raise the weak into a place of strength by supporting them, was frowned upon by Galton, because he saw the weak as those who did not survive the natural tests in society, and that if they could not survive those tests, why should we support them economically? We should leave them to their end, because we should be supporting those who are surviving the tests, who are overcoming the tests. The thing about it, though, was that Galton's ideas never took a hold in the UK, and I'm thankful for that. But they became very popular in America. And so we're going to move over to America to see how popular it actually became, and how eugenics took quite a significant hold within American society and state. So I'm just going to play this video. It's 10 minutes, but I think it really helps to give us a picture of eugenics in America. Right, so I think one of the things, the reason why I wanted to play that video is it actually tells you how far eugenics has gone, right up to the present day, and how the philosophy of eugenics, which found its sort of history and its legacy in the theory of evolution, how that's actually impacted society. This observation, moving from this sort of religious philosophical position into one of natural theology, into an observational investigation, which is natural history, and then coming out of that into sort of a clear theory that then unpacks itself into the society through science, government, law, and policy. Now, one of the things I wanted to land on was how recent this still is with us. Within that time when eugenics arose and became popular, these were the laws that had been implemented in order to support eugenics within America. And I think it's so interesting, isn't it? The hypocrisy when America talks about Germany and its crimes, when actually it was the seed from which Germany sort of took fruit to implement through the Nazi rule its own evils. So couple of things I wanted to highlight here was the legal impacts of eugenics on up to what they reckon up to between 30 and 50 states within America. On the left-hand side, we can see the laws that were implemented. So marriage restriction laws implemented in 1895, which basically did not allow or meant that the government could interfere with those who are disabled, deceased, or poor marrying if it wasn't good for society. There were the eugenics marriage laws, which basically focused upon requiring tests for sexually transmitted diseases in 1913. There was racial integrity laws in the 1920s, and that was to prevent interbreeding of different racial types. And the reason why I want to highlight that particularly is because it's this idea of good stock within the eugenics thinking, that in order to create the best of humanity, we need to breed out what is weak and breed in what is good. And so part of that then focused on the issue of races and racial hierarchy, which is a major factor. And you saw this racial integrity law also just coming after the law that came in afterwards, which is the immigration restriction law. You could see how they worked hand in hand in order to raise, quote unquote, this good stock in American society. So you had this idea of, well, there's now a racial hierarchy embedded within society, and those of different color are lower in that hierarchy, and they definitely cannot interbreed with those who are white Americans. And so you had the racial integrity laws coupled with the immigration restriction laws to protect the stock under the banner of eugenics. And then finally, you had the sterilization laws, and you just read on that, where in terms of giving the powers to local states to determine the level of fitness of an individual and whether or not they needed to be sterilized. And that was, by the way, that was heavily impacted women in a major way. The legal practice of sterilization affected the poor, the disabled, the ill, and minority groups such as Native Americans, Black or Mexican women. There are even lawsuits at the moment that are still on the books regarding atrocities committed right up until 2013. Because the reason for this is sterilization was used extensively on prison inmates. And it's been recently reported that 150 women had undergone sterilization in California prisons. And that was between 2004 and 2013. And the reason for that is prisoners are given the option to, if they voluntarily sterilize, to have reduced prison sentences. So the issue there is about consent. It's about the state, through its institutions, pressurizing people to be sterilized in order to secure a better quality of life for the nation. A couple of other things I wanted to flag as well was the supporters of eugenics. So Theodore Roosevelt was a supporter of eugenics. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor, was a supporter. Helen Keller, the author and a political activist, she was a supporter of eugenics. Winston Churchill was also a supporter of eugenics. Margaret Sanger, which I'm sure some of you will know, who was the abortionist who founded Planned Parenthood. She also was an advocate of eugenics, especially amongst the races, lesser races. And interesting, Webb Du Bois, who was an African-American activist, was also a supporter of it. Jacques Cousteau, who's an explorer, supported it. John Harvey Kellogg's, the gentleman who created Kellogg's cereal, the cereal that we buy, he was a supporter of it. And then finally, going back a fair bit, as Plato was also, although did not coin the term eugenics, agreed with the idea of population control. So we still have many supporters in society of this. But the other thing as well is the data on the right-hand side. I mean, from 1921 up until 1964, you can see the number of sterilizations that took place within America. They actually believe there were more. This is what's been recorded, but amongst the groups, other groups, specifically around Mexicans, particularly amongst the Native Americans, the Black and the Mexicans, they believe that there was much, much more. But yeah, so I want you to realize that this how tied into and locked into society this whole philosophy, what it believed to be a scientific philosophy, that was embedded in society and where it's still at today. Before I get into the biblical position on it, I wanted to just mention this. Ray Comfort, who is an evangelist within America, said this, and that was that the legacy of Darwin's theory can be seen in the rise of eugenics, euthanasia, infanticide, and abortion. And I absolutely agree with that. I think it's very clear that Darwin's theory has spawned eugenics, and eugenics has manifested in these policies. Now, when you look at these policies, euthanasia, infanticide, and abortion, you hear them today. You actually hear these conversations taking place within society, within law, within government, about human life. So it's still with us. And there is always the arguments I'm hearing today, especially in regards to the genetics work, is that we're in a far better place. We know more, and that the eugenics before was limited in its knowledge, hence why it wasn't implemented properly, and there was the ethical element to it. I don't buy that. I think the fact is the seed, the tree, and the fruit are all the same. So and I think that it's very clear that if something's bad, it needs to be culled, basically. I wanted, on this particular section, I wanted to end on this graphic, which I think is so important. And this was a logo from the Second International Eugenics Conference in 1921. And it depicts eugenics as a tree which unites a variety of different fields. And specifically, when you look at the roots of the tree, you can see that it touches on everything. It's not disconnected from society. It's on the right-hand side, you can see where it's into medicine and surgery and psychiatry and sociology and religion and education and genealogy and biography and statistics and politics and anthropology and psychology and genetics and biology. This thing is hardwired into society. So I don't believe that eugenics has gone away at all. I believe that, built on the idea of it being self-direction of the human evolution, as soon as human beings want to become the primary decision makers on their future and how they evolve, then straight away, eugenics is really at the heart of that. It's a major part of it, and we can't be disconnected from it. But a couple of things I want to highlight as well is that the legacy of eugenics has become embedded in scientific culture of many countries through policies which include genetic screening. So whenever you think about screening, which is to test for things within the body, that's linked to eugenics. Birth control, promoting different birth rates, marriage restrictions, segregation, I've mentioned this. Transhumanism, which is about human advancement through technology. Compulsory sterilization, forced abortions, or forced pregnancies, ultimately culminating in a form of genocide. So we can see the way in which it is like a cancer within society. Its goals might seem novel in terms of the progression of humans, but the way that it does it is through the destruction of humanity. By 2014, gene selection, rather than people selection, was made possible through advances in genome editing, leading to what is sometimes called new eugenics, also known as neo-eugenics, consumer eugenics, or liberal eugenics. So this is very interesting. Whereas eugenics in its original form was about people selection, now we have a eugenics which is about gene selection. And that's where we get designer babies from. It's this idea that we can interrupt the progression of human life and remove that which is its weaknesses and build upon that which is its strengths. And so gene editing, gene selection, gene editing is something that we need to consider as part of the offspring of eugenics. Arguably, the line on whether modern genetic methods are eugenic or not in practice comes down to whether the decision is enforced by the state or consented by the citizen. That's something that's also very important. It seems to be the conversation about old eugenics and modern eugenics seems to be about the ethics. Does the person ask for it or not? Or are they being suppressed, oppressed by the state? I think that is not the only basis of it, but I think it's fundamental to recognize that in the conversations that our nations are having around these topics. I'm going to end on this slide, which is, what does the Bible have to say? I think the Bible is very clear, and I always like to take the perspective that Jesus took, which is a perspective on, let's go to Genesis. What was it like? What was it supposed to be in the beginning? And actually, I find that the book of Genesis answers all the questions to evolution and to eugenics in particular. And in effect, I wonder if some of these answers would have come forth at the time when there was a resistance and a battle between natural theology and natural history. So the first things first, when it comes to evolution, Genesis 1:20-25 makes it very clear that everything was created according to their kinds. It doesn't take much to understand that. And so we can observe microevolution or adaptability within the various kinds of creatures that God has created. We can see that. And so we can't, in that regard, there isn't an argument to be had about microevolution, because it's true that there is adaptability within the kinds that God has created. And remember, I showed you the diagram between the microevolution and macroevolution. So where we disagree with the biologists of the day is around macroevolution. There is no consistent evidence to show, there's no evidence to show species changing from one form to another. There is evidence for microevolution. There's evidence in us to show change, whether it's in color of skin, color of eyes, our hair, our physiology. There's evidence for that. But there isn't evidence for macroevolution. So the Bible's consistent about microevolution. The next thing is that we can observe the blessings of God's fruitfulness and multiplication in creation. The idea of the creation in kinds, in being able to pass on traits, to be able to pass on biology from, I should say, an organism passing on its qualities and traits from one generation to the next. We can see that. We can see that because God said, be fruitful and multiply within that kind. So wolves, dogs, cats, across all types of organisms, we see a passing down or an inheritance of their genes from one generation to the next. And we see it within our own. We see our own children. We can observe that. And we can see that within our own children, them taking on the characteristics of their parents. And we enjoy that. The thing is, that's a blessing. We enjoy that. We enjoy to see a bit of ourselves in our children. Even though they're brand new DNA, we enjoy seeing that element of ourselves in them. And then the third thing is this, which we may not have thought about, but we can identify our responsibility to classify creation. But it's within the context of the Lord revealing his work to us. You know, in both the first presentation I did, which was about the origin of nations, and this presentation, we see men and women classifying the world around them. Okay, the classification isn't a problem. We see Adam in the book of Genesis God presenting him animals and birds before he presented Eve, and Adam was naming them. So we can see that we can identify that we are to classify the world around us. However, we are to classify the world around us through the Lord revealing to us his work. You know, when the Lord brought the animals to Adam, it was saying, this is what I created here. This is what I created here. It always started with God's creation. It didn't start with man assessing what was in front of him without God. And so we are to classify, but we're to classify in partnership, in working collaboration with the Lord God, not without him. Because when we begin to classify things without him, that's when we take the path which leads us astray. In our fourth point is that in Genesis 3, we see Adam rebelling the commandment and choosing to determine good and evil for himself. And I think that when I think about eugenics, and we go back to the tree that I showed you earlier, one of the key things at the top of that tree was that eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And isn't that a philosophy that is born directly out of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? We can witness the waywardness and extremes of our self-determination and decision-making without God and biblical history. You see, when God commanded man in the garden to not eat of the tree of life, to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when he commanded him to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it was a command. It wasn't a choice. He said to him, he gave him a choice first. The first choice he gave him was, you can eat of any tree in the garden. So he gave Adam the liberty of choice for every tree, and that included the tree of life. However, when it came to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it wasn't a choice, it was a command. The reason why Adam and humanity have rebelled God is because they rebelled a command. So what we learn from that particular portion of Genesis is that God is able to give us the realm where we are to choose from and the realm where we're not supposed to choose from. The realm where there's choice for us, the freedom to eat of any tree, including the tree of life, and the realm where these are his commandments and they must be obeyed. And so when we look specifically at Adam's rebellion, we realize that he chose to determine what was good and evil. And so when we analyze the fruit of eugenics, we see man's choices to determine what's good and evil and the impact of those choices on other human beings. We see when man moves from Godkind to mankind, he is not very good at making decision-making about life. He's not very good, one, at classifying life, and then also understanding the purpose of life and making decisions about life, including the life of other human beings. Finally, we can witness through Adam's legacy the issue of an unrepentant mankind rejecting its godly heritage. And this is so important, really important. We can see that by rejecting his godly heritage, he rejects the vision of a new man. You know, Adam's rebellion, it affected a number of things. It affected the way his legacy, it affected the way he perceived himself, being mankind rather than Godkind. It affected the way he perceived his legacy, because his children would be born in hardship rather than joy. And then it affected his perception of creation. We know that the ground was cursed and he would now wrestle with creation rather than the real enemy. You see, he'd given himself over to the dominion of Satan, and so he could not have dominion over the earth. And these are the fundamental things we see emerging in the unrepentant man of today. The man who's from the legacy of Adam, who is unrepentant, will always reject the godly heritage, will always reject the solution that God has provided, And in so doing, he will put himself into a situation where he essentially prefers to fix the old world rather than accept the new man to bring in the new world. And that's the sum total of the situation we find ourselves in. For many of us who are part of the new creation, we are participating in and looking forward to the entrance of the new world into our affairs. But for many of the people around us who are part of the old man, the old creation, they are spending most of their time trying to fix it. And that's what eugenics is. Eugenics is essentially at the heart of it. It's a man or men trying to fix the world in their image rather than accepting the destruction they have caused, repenting for it, bowing to Christ, and allowing him to bring in the new world in God's image, which is the full restoration of the kingdom.